I'm Katie Novak, and I'm so excited to be spending your afternoon with you to talk about my favorite thing, which is really this concept of inclusion. And I'm super excited right now, actually. Yesterday was like a really beautiful day in my school district. We were honored as only 100 schools in the country. Our high school was honored for excellence in unified sports by the Special Olympics. So we have a number of unified sports teams where our varsity athletes will partner with one of their Best Buddies through the Best Buddies program, and we run a really robust unified sports league where our kids will play a full schedule in unified basketball and in unified track and unified cross country, and it's been this really amazing experience. And yesterday we were honored by the Special Olympics who came out, and so we did a big pep rally for all of our unified athletes. And what was really amazing about this is the president of our Best Buddies chapter came out and said, so many people think of inclusion as being something that the system has to do, or something that the administrators have to do, or something that the teachers have to do. But the reality is we decide and we fight for who belongs here in the school, and it's up to us. And I felt that there was something just so powerful and beautiful about the fact that students are starting to appreciate that the things that we're doing systematically as administrators and as teachers is really helping students to see that every single person has equal worth in our world and in our classrooms. And that has really what has been the thing that has always driven me in UDL, is this concept of how do we create an environment where we truly value every single learner and we provide them with equitable access to classrooms with their peers where they're all equally challenged and supported. And that's a message of inclusion that is so, so critical for all students. And I was so happy to see that in the district where I work. And they actually played a unified basketball game, which was just amazing. They were blasting music. It was full pep rally style. And just to show that, all means all throughout our district. And it's in sports and it's in academics. And so, deciding a little bit of how do we start the design of lessons and curriculum in classrooms so that we can create a system that truly believes that all means all, and everyone should have equal opportunities to access really meaningful instructional experiences with their peers. So I'm going to just take a minute here and share my screen and take you through this presentation. And I'm going to stop periodically and check in, and just to see if you have any questions or concerns. You are welcome to write anything in the chat box. If you want to connect with me on Twitter, you can just use hashtag UDL and I'll look that up. And then also you can just unmute yourself or use the video and talk to me that way. If you feel like this is not the place to have a conversation, if you want to reach out to me in email, that's awesome as well. And also I'm going to be emailing tonight number of participants in this webinar just to check in individually to see how your UDL journey is going. So to start off, one of my favorite analogies to talk about this concept of variability are the love languages. And so this is a concept in psychology. A Dr. Chapman, who has been a marriage counselor for decades, was realizing that so many of his patients were coming to him for marital and relationship counseling. And they were saying, my partner just doesn't love me anymore. And he was hearing over time that people would be like, what are you talking about? I don't love you. Like, I wash your car, I do the grocery shopping. And, the other partner was like, yeah, but you don't do this. And so essentially over time, he has conceptualized that there are actually 5 ways that people show love to other people. And this is not just in romantic relationships, but between colleagues and best friends and students. And so essentially there are 5 love languages. I have 5 bullet points and also 5 visuals, but essentially the 5 love languages are words of affirmation, acts of service, gifts, quality time, and physical touch. So to just kind of explain this, to like really break it down, some of us, to feel truly appreciated, to feel truly loved, need somebody to give us that positive affirmation. We need someone to tell us, you look beautiful today. You worked so hard on that project. I'm so proud of you for cleaning your room. The affirmation actually really, really drives the motivation. And for some people, it's not like anyone would look at these things as like a bad thing. It's just not a critical component. So you don't need it to feel loved. And we can see this again if you think of like a special person, whether it's a child or a friend or a partner, okay, anyone who you have in mind, that person has a dominant love language. The next one is acts of service. My love language is acts of service, which is do something for me, clean the house, bring me dinner, like pick up the kids. And this is like, you're going to show me love by doing something and taking something off my plate. Gifts are pretty obvious. This is just, oh, you bought that for me. You thought of me. It's the possession that feels really powerful, that person saw this thing in this space of the universe and felt like it would be good for me to have. Quality time is obviously carving out time for board games, for walks on the beach, to just sit and look into each other's eyes and have a conversation. And then the last one is physical touch. For kids, it might mean fist bumps and handshakes and hugs. For best friends and partners, it's like that pat on the back, the hand on the arm. So these love language are what drive relationships. And what Chapman realized over time is that the way that we communicate love is the way that we expect to receive love. And this is where we have conflicts and barriers. So if my husband, Lon, is a words of affirmation person, he is always texting me every day, like, I have the best wife. I'm so proud of you. If you read his Twitter feed, it's like, my wife is so awesome. I'll still get like notes every day. I miss you. I love you. He's very much into words of affirmation. So of course, that is what he expects in return. I, on the other hand, am an acts of service person, right? So if he, let's say, goes and cleans the whole house and I come home, I am like, the house is clean. This is the epitome of love for Katie Novak. I don't have to do anything. This is amazing. So in return, I'm going to vacuum the cars. And what happens is Lon comes home and he'll be like, didn't you notice that I clean the house? And I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, so awesome. Yay, best husband ever. And he's like, yeah, but I vacuumed under the couch, right? And so there's this disconnect, which is rather comical because both of us are very aware of our love languages. Now, why on earth am I starting out a webinar on education and inclusive practice about love languages? And this is because predominantly what we find through research is that teachers tend to design lessons and teach in ways they feel would be engaging. And that is not received as engaging by the students. So this concept of, we're going to do a skit. It's going to be amazing. Everyone can dress up. People love skits. Reality is, nope, because there's a lot of ways to express understanding that doesn't involve standing up in front of a room. This whole concept of, yes, but we all have to read this book because this book is so important and we all have to understand the themes and connect with the characters. The reality is other people are not going to have that same experience. And so we end up with so many disconnects because in theory, all of us are designing for the optimal experience that we would wish to have. And we are not our students. We have a great, great variability of kids, and we're using our own implicit bias and our own dominant learning culture to design experiences that we think are going to work for all students. And this results in a lot of disappointment for teachers because we spend so much time and so much love and so much effort to create this experience that we think is going to work for all students. And the reality is it will never work for all students. A one-size-fits-all curriculum fits very, very few students. And so using this analogy of the love languages, we have to think about what is it that we're actually trying to build, and then how do we build it? And so this is a visual that's used to explain a multi-tiered system of support, which in California is a really critical framework for how we deliver services and create a system that meets the needs of all students. Now, most people want to read this from the inside out. Okay, that is how most educators are going to approach this visual. Okay, so we're going to look at that schoolhouse on the inside, which traditionally has been a triangle with 3 tiers, which we a lot of the times call RTI, or response to intervention. But response to intervention is very, very focused on student academics, and it's very focused on what are we going to do when students don't learn. But in the inside of that triangle, what we do know about RTI and what we have known about RTI since 2004, when the U.S. Department of Education really endorsed it as a way to meet the needs of students when we had significant achievement gaps, when we look at Tier 1, it is always said all students. And the reality is districts didn't build that. Most districts only created tier 1 for those students who arrived ready to learn. And so the reality is a multi-tiered system is built on a foundation that all students are able to access the least restrictive environment available to them, which would be a general education classroom where their needs are able to be met either through support through a co-teacher or co-planning. And so to do this, if we really want every kid to be in a tier 1 classroom together, we also acknowledge that some students will need targeted support in remediation or more intensive support. But what the federal legislation says is this must supplement and not supplant tier 1 instruction. So you can't, in theory, by federal law, pull a child out of tier 1 to put them in tier 2 because now you're supplanting. You're giving them instruction instead of and not in addition to grade level rigor. So if we want all students to be in the tier 1 universal support, we have to move out to that blue circle on the outside. And that is that academics, behavior, and social emotional learning has to be universally designed, and also all students have to have equitable access for learning experiences in all 3 areas. Now, I'm going to unpack that for a second because most people think of universal design for learning as an academic framework only, and that is absolutely not the case. UDL is a framework for reducing barriers in any learning environment. And so sometimes students come to us and they don't quite understand the expected behaviors and or they don't have the self-regulation skills or the social emotional coping to actually model and follow through with those expected behaviors. So in tier 1, we are required by a multi-tiered system to universally design our academics, which means that there's options and choices and proactive planning to be really clear about the expectations and the many different pathways to meet those standards. But we also have to do that through our behavioral lens, which sometimes we call PBIS or a responsive classroom. And then we also have to do that for a social emotional lens, which is sometimes looked at as like a second step or an open circle. Those are 2 examples of curriculum that really focus on tiered social and emotional support. But what you're realizing is that UDL encompasses all 3 of those things. So first we start with, we believe all students can be educated together in tier 1. But that will only occur if academics, behavior, and social emotional learning are universally designed. When they are universally designed, that results in equitable access for all students. Now, what that means is we take those 2 terms, equity and access. Access means I get a seat in your room. So if you're a 3rd grade teacher, I get a seat in your general education room. If you're an 8th grade teacher, if you're an 11th grade teacher, okay, I get a seat in your room. Equitable access means I get a seat in your room regardless of the color of my skin, my ethnicity, my socioeconomic status, my ability, my disability. And so equitable access, which is now a requirement through like the civil rights lens, requires universal design for learning. So this was endorsed in all federal legislation. Now the reality is now you have to step out again to this outer tier, because we're not going to universally design academics and behavior and social emotional learning to provide equitable access to students until we have these drivers. And those are the systems things that work from the outside. So the competency drivers are like, how do we ensure that teachers have the capacity to universally design academics, behavior, and social emotional learning so that all students have equitable access to tier 1? And that's things like professional development, instructional coaching, EdEval, mentoring systems, onboarding, faculty meetings. Those are all of the systems drivers that can improve the outcomes of teachers' ability to be able to do that, right? Because if all learners do the best they can with what they have, that is true for our amazing educators as well. The next part is leadership drivers. Leadership need to create the schedules, needs able to like allocate the resources to the staffing to build the culture and the buy-in. So there's shared responsibility for building this system, for increasing this capacity, so that we're changing our mindset to actually believe and fight for the fact that all kids deserve to be in classrooms together. And then lastly, we have those implementation drivers, and those implementation drivers are things like, do we have a curriculum that is evidence-based? based? Do we have a data-driven system where we have universal screening tools and progress monitoring tools? Do we have the capacity to talk about teaching and learning and to have co-planning? So when we think about multi-tiered systems, often we kind of just pick like one place, or we just think of the schoolhouse, like, oh, tier 1, 2, and 3. The reality is, and the opportunity is, a multi-tiered system, you have to read it from the outside in. So if we want to create a system based on universal design for learning that is focused on academics and behavior and social emotional learning, we first have to build competency in an organization. We have to get our leaders on board, and we have to have strategic plans to make sure that we have the curriculum and the staffing and the scheduling to make that happen. So where all of you are living right now is in this competency driver outer realm, and you're here in this webinar to build your own competency in UDL, in academics, behavior, and social emotional learning, because the ultimate outcome is for you to have a tier 1 classroom that all students can be successful in all 3 of those areas. So that is a very big picture about why we're here. And I wanted to start there before we dive in deeper into how do we begin to design these universally designed experiences academically, behaviorally, and socially emotionally. But also, I just want all of you to know that we're just like scratching the surface, and we're just beginning the conversation about this really important work. So if after this webinar you're like, I don't quite know how to like completely dismantle my system and to implement UDL, there are so many more opportunities to do that by interacting with me via email, by making sure that your district puts this as a priority area, and to make sure that you really stay in touch with your SIP team here at the Riverside County Office of Education, because they are here to support you in the long run of building a multi-tiered system that lives on this foundation of UDL. So I'm going to stop my screen share there before we dive in a little bit more. And I just want to see if any of you have any comments or questions about this concept of multi-tiered systems and where UDL lives in a multi-tiered systems. In a multi-tiered system, rather. So I'm going to check my Twitter real quick on my phone and see if anyone has anything on Twitter. Again, you can use a hashtag UDL, and I'll be able to see if you have any questions. I am also looking at the chat box if any of you have anything. Any comments or questions would be fabulous. And check UDL, and then we're going to keep going here. Okay. I don't see anything in the chat. My wait time is good. So if you got anything, keep it coming. Okay. So we're going to dive back in now. We have this basis of like, we understand variability. We understand that one size fits all won't fit anybody. And now we're going to be really unpacking this concept of how do we create this robust, universally designed system. So to go back to a previous webinar, this is a really important slide, because when you're thinking about tier 1 needs to be universally designed in 3 different areas. So you can see we're not just talking about academics, we're talking about academics, behavior, and social emotional learning. And essentially 4 very, very interrelated components make up a curriculum. And in a universally designed classroom, we want all students to be able to self-differentiate their way through that curriculum. So for instance, in academics, we have academic standards. We have very, very clear academic standards of like what we expect students to know and be able to do. We also should have very clear behavioral expectations in our classroom. Sometimes we create a classroom management plan in partnership with students. It might be that we have a school-wide BPIS plan that has really clear expectations for expectations for behavior. And we also need to start thinking about the concept of coping, of growth mindset, of grit. Because social emotional learning is really like, how do you self-regulate your emotions? How do you deal with relationships socially? How do you deal with the challenge and rigor of really intense, challenging curriculum, which is actually very good academically, but some students don't have the internal capacity to deal with the social emotional ramifications of challenge? How do you deal with classmates who are different from you? So this concept of embracing like diversity in windows. And then we also have to teach kids how to cope with the things that we have no control of, that are not alterable within our schools. which is the trauma they may face outside of school, their own cultural practices. So what we have to do first is we have to make the expectations really clear. In UDL, the guideline is we have to heighten the salience and goals of objectives. So when we do that, we make it very, very clear at the beginning of class, this is what we're going to learn academically and why. These are the expectations I have for behavior and why. And these are all the options that you're going to have to cope with the challenge, with the frustration as we work. And that seems like a lot of building of a foundation. But the reality is like the house that I'm sitting in right now without a really strong foundation is going to crumble. And a universally designed lesson, no matter how brilliant it is designed, if that foundation of expectations is not built, that may crumble as well, which is so frustrating when you put so much time and energy into it. And so the 4 aspects of curriculum are goals, methods, materials, and assessments. And so the goal is basically what is going to be your plan to meet that standard. So for example, if we say to students behaviorally, my expectation is as you are reading, you are all silent. Okay, everyone's going to be silent. Now, you're welcome to like read it with your eyes on paper. You're welcome to use an audiobook. You're welcome to use an ebook. But when you're done, you're going to start responding in some sort of writing. You know, of course, you're going to have options for using graphic organizers. You're going to have options for sentence stems and exemplars. You can write it by hand. You can use your computer. But think about what you need to not only meet the academics, but to sit quietly in this class. Do you need a snack? Do you need water? Do you need to put in your earbuds and listen to music? Do you need to move away from a friend? Do you need a more comfortable chair? Like that works into a universally designed classroom. So the goals are not just academic. The goals are academic, behavioral, and social emotional. The next thing is what are the steps that you need to follow in order to meet this ultimate goal? So the goal for all 3, what do you need for methods? The next is what materials do you need? So it's not only the graphic organizers and the scaffolds, it might be the fidget tools and the headphones and gum. And then lastly, how are you going to show me that you actually met that standard? And UDL is a standards-based design. So in no way does it decrease rigor. And sometimes because it doesn't decrease rigor, it increases the inability to self-regulate because we want students to be challenged. We want them to be supported, but we also want them to grow and reach. And if they already know everything we're teaching, like, what's the point of me being there? You know, I want cognitive dissonance. I want people to be uncomfortable with the content. And that means I'm doing things well, but I also have to prepare them. If I do my job well, you will be uncomfortable. And let's talk as a class of how we're going to deal with this discomfort. You know, how are we going to deal with breaks? How are we going to deal with our ways to cope? And then sometimes coping is peer review, working with a teacher, and some of those scaffolds that we're talking about. So knowing that we're trying to self-differentiate, what we want to do is I want to go through this lens of how specifically we design to create classrooms that not only are rigorous academically, but support behavior and social emotional learning. And to do this, we really have to take a lens of culturally responsive teaching. And a lot of people think that culturally responsive teaching or culturally sustaining pedagogy, which is the result of culturally responsive teaching, is almost like an afterthought or something that you have to do in addition to UDL. But if you look at the 7 characteristics of culturally responsive teaching and you think of them through the lens of these 3 different success areas, which are like academics, social, emotional, and behavior, what you're going to realize is that in following the principles of UDL in a multi-tiered system, if you follow those principles and guidelines, you will be a culturally responsive teacher, and this will result in culturally sustaining pedagogy, which will significantly increase student engagement, student behavior, student social emotional functioning, and then it will also significantly decrease discipline issues and office referrals. So if you research Brown University, it's going to basically take all the research on culturally responsive teaching, which is really the brainchild of Ladson and Billings, and it's going to focus on these 7 key areas. And I want to look at these 7 areas through the lens of not only UDL, but this concept of like, how do we provide these choices and then also ensure that behavior is really respectful and conducive to rigor. And, you know, in talking with, you know, our colleagues in California, one of the things that came up is, teachers buy into the fact that this is important. We want to create inclusive classrooms, but when we start giving options and choices academically, sometimes it feels as though like all the roosters are leaving the nest at the same time. It's like wild. And it's like, oh my gosh, like this is not successful and I'm not seeing academic gains. And it may be because the lens was focused solely on academics. And, when we reel back a little bit and we think about like, what are our standards for academics, for behavior, for social emotional learning, and are our expectations for all of those things culturally sustaining for every student? We sometimes see the barriers in our own design, and that allows us to address them through the concept of universal design. So one of the very most important ground rules here for inclusion is that we always assume good intentions and we have an asset-based view of students and their families. And what I know and what I hear, because I spend a lot of time in teachers' rooms in my district as a .8 assistant superintendent and all around the country, is that we tend to think in a lot of ways of students and families as being deficit based. Those kids won't behave. Those kids can't behave. I call the parents there no help. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And I'm not trying to be fresh here, but the reality is that these conversations happen. Now, I want you to think about, just take like 30 seconds. I know there's a whole slew of you in a room together, so you can actually talk about this. The rest of you can like reflect or send a tweet or use the chat box, but I just want you to think about this statement. And this might seem unrelated to UDL and behavior, but it is absolutely not. All student caregivers are doing the best they can with what they have. Okay, so these babies that we are entrusted with, for 6 or 7 hours a day, they come from caregivers. Their caregivers, allow us to be with them for 6 hours a day. And they're with them for the majority of the time. But like in that time, do we truly honestly believe that they're doing everything they can to help these kids be successful? And that is the first step for like bridging the gap for like cultural responsiveness. So again, I'm going to stop for I'm going to put on a timer for 30 seconds and we might be like sitting here smiling at each other. Stop share. But I want you to think about this concept of, do we truly have an asset-based view of every student and every family? Okay. And that would mean I'm looking at kids and being like, wow, this kid is doing the best they can with what they have. I must have to change something about this environment. Or like, man, these families must want to do everything they can to help their kids. I must have to change my parent community engagement if they're not responding. Okay, that's the frame of mind that you need to have in the UDL world. So 30 seconds, I'm going to put on my timer. And then I do have a question from Kevin, which I'll answer, but I just want to make sure there's nothing on Twitter. Okay, so again, you're going to respond to that statement. Do you believe that everyone in your school truly believes that all parents and students are doing the best they can with what they have? Okay. So you might be talking about it. You might just be pondering. Okay. I love it. Kristen's like, Fresno says no. Emily says no. Okay, so when we're asking ourselves, and this is like amazing, like this is absolutely amazing, 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 amazing to admit. And I think you can start some amazing conversations. And even if people don't know about UDL, this is a great place to start, is if we don't have an asset-based view of students and our families, we have already lost so much potential to grow them as learners. And that is because as we move forward, you're going to see that the second most important things is high expectations for all. And when we have a deficit-based view of students or their families, we have lower expectations for them. So let's say that we have a kid and we like love this student, but we're like, oh, their family, it's like they come from such a rough home. I can't ask them to do this. That's a lower expectation that results in lower performance. So, Kristen said overall, people are saying no. I wouldn't say everybody believes that. Emily said no. James said not every teacher is willing to be vulnerable enough to entertain the fact that the challenges in part are alterable, that we contribute to those challenges. And then it says that a lot of teachers probably do believe that they are, and maybe that isn't the case yet. And just to be clear, pity is a form of deficit-based thinking. So if you feel bad for a family, that equates to low expectations in the research on social justice. So if you say, oh, I don't have a low view of student families, I just feel so bad because they can't help them, you will expect less from the kid the second you allow yourself to believe that. And so this concept of, when we're talking about a deficit-based environment, as we're thinking about UDL and about challenging all students, we are less likely to challenge students who we feel in our own flawed implicit bias are not able to meet the challenge. And UDL is all about we move all kids to their highest level of potential. And I know from research and from my own experience is that sometimes we ceiling out kids. And when we ceiling out kids, the result of that oftentimes are behavioral problems. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that concept. So we start off with this concept of really positive perspectives of families. So one great example of this is the classic one size fits all back to school night, right? In American education, the old wives' tale is parents who really want their kids to succeed are able to get off work and get transportation and get childcare and feed their kids dinner and show up from 7 to 8 p.m. on this night to go to their kids' classrooms, where we speak for an hour only in English, we assume some background in education, and then we send them off. Now, I'm being incredibly fresh right now, but back to school night is like the most obvious example ever of a one size fits all curriculum, which doesn't work for all families. So when you think about, well, what are the barriers that prevent all people from being able to support their kids? You start to say, some people might not have transportation, some people might not have childcare, some people might have to work. So even with transportation and childcare, they can't take work off. And so just the type of thinking that UDL requires is okay, if transportation is a problem, let's send our bus crew. We'll send our bus fleet around and let parents know that we're happy to pick them and their children up. We're also going to make sure that childcare is provided by our National Honor Society, who they need to collect community service hours. So let's invite families in. We'll provide them with a meal. We'll provide them with transportation. We're going to have a couple of different times. They can come in the morning. They can come in during my lunch. They can come in at night. I'm going to create my meetings based off the bus schedule if you're in a more urban area that has a bus schedule. And then sometimes the reality is you're still not going to connect with some families. And how often do we go into their world to connect? So in my town, Groton, Massachusetts, we have the biggest Sikh temple in all of the country, second biggest in the world. And so we have a number of newcomers here who, attend temple. And so one of the things that we need to really focus on here is how often do we reach out to our community and our religious organizations, our penitentiaries, our YMCAs, and say, hey, I'd be happy to come and give a presentation if you'd like to have me. And so, when we believe that every parent is doing the best they can with what they have, we give them the tools that allow them to use that. And this leads into high expectations for students. So when we're talking about accountability, when we're talking about this concept of what allows districts to be successful, you're looking at a couple of different factors overall nationally. States are looking at student achievement, student growth, our ability to graduate kids. There's a big focus lately on this concept of English language learners and how we allow them to build proficiency. And then sometimes we'll look at different states, look at, chronic absenteeism or how many kids complete advanced coursework. But essentially, all this has to do is with high expectations for all kids. Now, what we know from all of the research on teaching and learning is that there's 296 teaching influences. Those are all outlined in Hattie's book on visible learning. And what's really, really fascinating about this is we think of things like discussion strategies and the curriculum we adopt and the feedback that we give to students and the collaborative groupings and the ability groupings. And sometimes we feel like that matters. And the reality is it doesn't. The new Every Student Succeeds Act requires all district initiatives to be evidence-based, which means that peer-reviewed research actually show that they are effective. Now, evidence-based is actually very different from research-based. So, for instance, UDL has a lot of research behind it. I could create a program tonight and sell it tomorrow as a research-based curriculum program, and I would be in my right, okay? A UDL program is a research-based program. But until I partner with a university or with a school district, and I go through the process of informed consent for all participants, and I have a methodology to actually unfold my new curriculum with fidelity and measure prior confounding variables, until I do all that and have peer-reviewed gold standard studies that it's effective, I cannot call my program evidence-based. And so what ESSA does is it says that it's not enough that it's scientific-based, it's not enough that it's research-based, it has to be evidence-based. Now, UDL is evidence-based, but when we look at the 3 most impactful practices we have in this entire universe that are evidence-based, it is all in here. It's literally all in teacher mindset. The number 1 indicator of student achievement, the number 1 is how well teachers think of themselves as practitioners who can meet the needs of all kids. It's called teacher efficacy. Do I believe I can teach all kids no matter what? And to do that, I sure as heck have to have an asset-based view of every single child who comes in my room. I have to find their strengths. I have to find something about them that I love. I have to respect and value their families. And when I do that, I am going to provide them with options and choices that allow them to be successful. Okay. And when I do that and they can feel the relationship with me, I guarantee you I will have less behavior problems than someone else. Now, if you look at that hinge point that says point 4, that is the point in research where we're allowed to say something is statistically significantly effective. Point 4, which is more than an average year of growth, which means that point 8, loosely, this is not a real mathematical concept, is more than 2 years of growth. So we are looking at 3 or 4 years of growth for a single child on average when the teacher's like, give me any kid and I can teach them. Second most impactful is self-reported grades. I have enough respect and value of my children that I say, I'm going to give you the rubrics, I'm going to give you exemplars, and I'm going to teach you how to self-assess. And you tell me what you're strong at and what you need to work on more, and we're going to work together. And then the third is just my expectations for student achievement. If I believe you can do well, you will do well. And just think about the power of that. Is we spend so much time on professional development for different frameworks and different standards and different curriculum. And the reality is nothing will trump a teacher who truly believes in all kids. And when I created the UDL progression rubric, we talk about emerging UDL practice, transitioning to proficient UDL practice, moving on to an expert practice. This does not mean expert practice for the teacher. It means that students are starting to become expert learners. And essentially what this equates to is when we're emerging, we allow options. It's still very teacher directed. It's still very much like you can do this or you can do that. And that's a great step forward for UDL. But the reality is in that model, some students still can't access it because it's still too restrictive. And so if you hear your colleague saying, the kids can't be in here, the kid can't do algebra, the kid can't behave in here, the reality is, as painful as this pill is to swallow, the reality is in the research on teacher efficacy and teacher expectancy, when a teacher says the kids can't, what it really means is I can't figure out how to create an environment that will allow that child to be successful. Teacher efficacy and teacher expectancy are very, very highly correlated. So a teacher who believes they can meet the needs of all kids is not going to say a kid can't, because they're admitting I can't. And I'm not going down like that. That kid will do it. I haven't figured out how he's going to do it yet, but he will do it because I believe in relationships and I believe in his family and I believe that every kid literally is trying to do the best they can with what they have. So let me eliminate all the crap that's preventing this kid from being successful, and then that kid is going to be successful because I am going to be successful. Now, where we have most of our teachers is that they're in a place where it's like, I really like teaching students when they arrive ready to learn. Now, that is not hard. And I mean this with love, okay? Teaching a bunch of compliant kids who are at about grade level is not a hard job, okay? The hard job is teaching all kids. That's the most rewarding job in the world, is taking kids who without you in their lives may never have known the potential that they really have. And then ultimately we want to get to a place where our efficacy in ourself is so high that our expectations for students are so high. So, if you're diving into this UDL work with colleagues and you're experiencing like, gosh, this is so frustrating, these kids can't behave, check your own expectations and start thinking about how much emphasis are you putting in proactively designing your expectations for behavior. How much are you actively teaching how to make really great choices? How much are you actively focusing on what are your expectations for when you're working together? What are your expectations when you're doing something different? When you tell you're getting off task, what are your expectations for how you're going to cope? Because that has to be taught as well. And what we realize is kids do the best they can with what they have. We have to give them something else if we expect them to be successful. And so what that brings me to here is this concept of learning within culture. And this is like a silly analogy that I used with my girlfriend, Pam Tuppy, who's at the Orange County Department of Education. We say that most people, when they think of creating a classroom, if you go back to the love languages, it's like, okay, this is going to be the best way to teach this concept in math. This is going to be the best science lab, right? And what we're doing is like that's our implicit bias. That's our dominant culture, right? And the best way to explain this is like, if I said to all of you, hey, think about what the beach means to you. Okay, if I just said that really quickly, think about what the beach means to you. What would be an enjoyable day for you at the beach? Some of you might be thinking of like some desolate little island where you're just sitting reading a book. Some other people might think of like fishing off like a little mountain, pond, or lake beach. Some people are thinking of like a really crowded beach in Hawaii. Now for me, when I think of the beach, I think of like a bikini and a tan, water sports, like jumping on a trampoline or like surfing, music. I always bring it like a boombox, not a boombox, but you know what I mean? The phone with like the speaker. I love beach food. I love like the burgers. I love the fried dough. That's like our thing here in New England. And if I said that and I pushed my concept of beach on you, some of you, I guarantee you, are going to be behavior problems. You will be, right? Because suddenly your idea was like, oh, I'm going to go fishing. It's going to be so quiet. Or like women in Saudi Arabia, for example, will wear like a burqa, right? And that is what works. And when I suddenly start pushing, no, this is what you're doing, okay, a couple of things start to happen, right? You're in a place that's very uncomfortable and it's very culturally inappropriate. And because you don't have a relationship with me to be able to explain that, like, listen, I could probably do this in another way. Is there, could I do this differently? This is really uncomfortable for me. Okay. What we end up with is we end up with a real problem with engagement. Now, this is one of my favorite visuals of all time because it talks about that engagement is a commitment or a combination of attention and commitment, right? And so when I'm thinking about the beach here, right, and I say, all of you, we're going on a field trip, all of you are coming with me to the beach, you're going to wear that bathing suit, you're going to eat that burger, and you're getting your butt on a surfboard. Okay. It's kind of like you're reading this book, you're completing this worksheet, you're standing up in front of the class and doing a presentation. Okay. And when we do that, what we end up with is a handful of kids are going to be like, right on, that is awesome. Right. Those are the kids who arrive ready to learn. Anyone could teach them. They're not that rewarding. Like, I love them. But like, that is not why we became teachers, to teach only kids who arrive ready to learn. You're going to have some people who are like, I don't want to do it, but they're still going to do it, right? That's called compliance, right? So they're able to behave. They're able to self-regulate the feeling of, I don't want to do this. Now, in very early emerging UDL, we do things like, listen, I'm going to tell you what, okay? Because we're like this and I like choices, I'm going to let you choose which bikini you're going to wear. Okay, you see how I'm working here, right? You're like, and I'm like, no. I'm going to be cool and you're going to get to choose your own bikini, or you can choose to have a cheeseburger or a hamburger, right? I'm still offering choice. I'm actually still emerging with UDL. Don't get me wrong. But the reality is some of you are going to start to retreat. Okay. Some of you are going to pull back. You're going to be absent on the day that I invite you to the beach. You're going to go to the bathroom a lot. Okay. You're going to go to the snack shack a lot. You're going to wear a big cover up over your bikini. You're going to just pull at the bits or the ends of your hamburger, right? That's called retreating. Okay. Kids fall asleep. They ask to go to the nurse, right? But that actually, retreating is a self-regulation strategy. Okay. When a kid is retreating, what you know is that they can't, in a healthy, compliant way, follow the expectations that you have set. Okay. They don't have the ability to regulate it. Now, retreating is best case scenario, because the kids we're all talking about here are the ones that choose to rebel. And I just want you to use the beach analogy to think about the fact that, like, if someone were to push you into wearing a bikini and going, like, you can feel yourself starting to get really fresh, right? And those kids, we say, are lost at school. We say they're behavior problems. What they're doing is they're coping in the best way they know how. Okay. The thing that is happening is not getting their attention, and or they don't have the necessary commitment to it. And so when we see behavior problems, one of the foremost experts in the entire country, who's a Harvard University professor, is Ross Greene. He wrote the book called Lost at School. And as you can see, the subtitle is Why Kids with Behavioral Challenges Are Falling Through the Cracks. And again, I would highly, highly recommend this book. I am in no way associated with Ross Greene, but it's a beautiful, eye-opening book. And he talks about all students do the best they can with what they have. You have to actively teach them what are the skills you need to self-regulate and what are the skills that you need to behave. And he has a nonprofit organization called Lives in the Balance, which actually aligns completely with this concept of UDL and how do we build executive function and how do we build self-regulation. So when we give students choices, they're able to make really good ones, self-regulate those choices, and then behave in a way that is compliant. And so when we see students who are rebelling or are retreating, the reality is that is a lack of engagement. And that is research, that is the affective network of the brain, that is neuroscience. That is a very hard pill to swallow, because we have the ability to create environments that increase engagement or decrease engagement. And teachers with a really high sense of efficacy acknowledge, gosh, I am not doing this yet in a way that is allowing these kids to be compliant. But teachers who take the time to try to really honor kids' cultures and where they are, and to talk about, okay, so what are we struggling with? How are we going to cope with it? Okay, let's talk about the behavioral expectations. Are they reasonable? Are they not reasonable? What do we need to do in order to follow through with them? When we make it really clear that the academics we're working on are meaningful and relevant in some way, we will see a much higher level of engagement and a much lower level of discipline problems. So I just want to, again, stop right there on this concept of UDL and how it aligns to behavior and how it builds on what we were talking about is, in this system, if we're truly universally designing our tier one, it means we're always, every teacher is simultaneously thinking about academics, behavior, and social emotional learning, all tied up into one. And when they do that, they believe all kids come to us with variability, do the best they can with what they have, and we need to be much more clear about our expectations and what options and choices do kids need in order to meet those expectations. So are there any questions about that concept of, like, embracing students' culture and students' current experiences to allow them options and choices to access the curriculum? So again, I don't see any. Just going to check Twitter real quick. We haven't had anything yet, but I don't want to miss it. Oh, we got something. Renee is tweeting. I love it. Okay, anything here? I know that higher up, Kevin had asked, is there an order in which goals, methods, material, and assessments are addressed when lesson planning? And I think that comes down to individual student variability. I mean student variability isn't teacher variability. So I would always create my standard first. I would come up with my essential question, and then I would design the assessment. And then I would say to the students, this is how I'm going to know if you did it. What do you think? Do you have any other ideas? This is what I'm thinking about using. You know, help me out. I'm willing to, like, revise this. I'm willing to create an additional assessment. Like, what do you think? This is the standard. This is ultimately what I need you to do. Do we have any pushback? We'd spend some time on that. Once I heard from the students what they thought about what they already knew and how they were going to get to the end, then I would go through goals, methods, materials. So I usually went like assessments first, almost in like a backwards design, to say like, ultimately, this is what this standards means in real life. This is what I have to know in the next 4 weeks that you're able to do. How do you want to do it? How do you want me to teach it? How do you want to learn it? What do I need to get? And so I really co-designed a lot of things with my students. Certainly I would start with like a small framework, but that was always very up to interpretation and flexibility as I like sat down and talked to my students every day. You say, do you find co-designing translates well to all ages, including preschool? Absolutely, 100% I do. And again, I'm going to give a couple of examples in the next couple slides of the type of thinking that you can use. But like, we're coming up on the holidays right now, and as very unpopular as it is, celebrating Christmas in schools is a form of implicit bias. It's a dominant religion. When you're thinking about the forms of implicit bias, it's very selective because that's only one holiday, that we celebrate. Other holidays become very invisible, so if you're in a minority religion or a minority culture, you're not going to be embraced as much. It's very stereotypical. So like most school celebrations are about the commercial aspects of Christmas. 50% of kids in this country are living below the poverty line. So giving students writing prompts like, what do you want for Christmas, sets up a lot of kids for like significant disappointment. And so when you're talking about all of this concepts of like, I want to design a curriculum on Christmas because kids are excited about it, the reality is that is now against civil rights law. You can't do it. What you can do is embrace all students for where they're at. So what you can do in preschool, for example, to co-design is like, you could say, what is a special tradition or thing you like to do with your family in December? And you get this whole slew of responses. Then you would go back and say, okay, so one of the things that we have as a preschool requirement is telling a story, okay? And you're going to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And since this is important, we're going to be talking about our family traditions, and it's going to be amazing. And so now that I know what some of your family traditions are, we're going to learn about XXXX. So that would be like a developmentally appropriate to involve preschoolers in the design of curriculum. As they get a little bit older, kindergarten, first grade, it might be, okay, so today we're going to learn about animal adaptations, and I'm going to show you a video about bats, and I'm going to talk to you about bats, and then we're going to read a piece about bats. And then from that, you're going to tell me what's the best way for you to learn. And we're all going to talk about the best ways for us to learn. And from there, it's going to help me choose things tomorrow when we learn about polar bears. So, you're very much using the knowledge of the students to say, your voice matters, your experience matters, your prior knowledge matters, and I'm going to use that to design something that works for you. So I am now going to share my screen again as we dive a little bit deeper into this. So if we know that UDL is a framework to eliminate the barriers for accessibility and engagement, and we know that engagement is all about attention and commitment, commitment really starts to overlap into behavior and social emotional learning because it requires self-regulation. And so when we need to provide students with choices, and I used this slide in the first webinar, but like I cannot stress this enough how important it is a lot of the times when we create universally designed lessons, we give a choice, right? We say you can do this, this, or this. We let the kids do the choice, execute the choice. And then it's a hot disaster in the classroom, right? You have kids choosing to work together, they're getting nothing done. You have students doing artwork, throwing crayons around the room, and you're like, oh my gosh. Now, the most important aspect of UDL is the review phase. Choose, do, review, repeat. Choose, do, review, repeat. I'm going to say it. You're going to hear me in your sleep, like sheep counting, right? So what I would say to students is I started with a goal, right? Before you make a choice, you make the goals clear. These are my goals academically. These are the goals behaviorally. These are the goals self-regulation-wise. There is no if, ands, or but about it. That is life. You have to know your task. You have to know your purpose. You have to know your audience. You behave differently in a library than you do at a football game. In this class right now, because this is the academic task, we need to work on this quietly. That is the expectation. What do you need to do in order to be able to work on this quietly? So you start off by heightening the salience of goals and objectives. And then you go and let them do their thing. But then you come back and you say, okay, everyone, This is what we were trying to achieve. Okay, these were the goals. How well did your choices allow you to get there? And how well did the choices of a class allow all of us to get there? And if we didn't get there, that's okay. What do we need to do differently the next time to get us there? And so, you know, kids only learn how to make good choices from making bad choices, just like us. And so if we really value all students and believe they're doing the best they can with what they have, and that their families are trying to do the best they can with what they have, and when we have high expectations for all students and realize that culturally they don't have the same ability as us to self-regulate and behave, then we have to allow them to like really think about their behavior and think about the consequences of that behavior. And that's where you start to see restorative circles and this concept of restorative justice that lives there. Okay, those are 2 UDL guidelines: having kids monitor their progress and having them foster self-assessment and self-reflection so they can make better choices, so they can set goals for improvement. And that's what restorative justice is all about. So if you're in a school that's working on that, that's actually a part of the UDL framework. And right now, Mirko Chardin and I are actually writing a book called Social Justice in the Hands of Educators, which is all about this concept of how does UDL transcend social justice? You know, how do you have to have an understanding of UDL to increase classroom management, to create restorative circles, to make sure you have a PBIS system? You know, UDL is the umbrella that will allow you to do these other things well. Because if there are barriers that prevent students from misbehaving, you have to figure out what those barriers are in your PBIS system and eliminate them through UDL. And if you set really clear expectations for the way students treat each other, and there are infractions of that, you hold a restorative circle as a way to review what the infractions were and how moving forward you have to do things differently. And so all of this is one big giant package of inclusive practice through UDL. So variability is this word we use all the time in UDL. And this is a thing. This is a real thing. It's not going away. And when we truly value variability, what we understand is like right now, we really value the kids that show up and can do the math. And again, I'm being a little fresh here, but like, we have kids who come forward and like they know a lot about cooking because they were raised by their grandmother and they could make like almost anything from scratch. We don't value that as much as the math. You know, we have kids who are an amazing athlete and they go out and run every single morning, or they work out after school, and they get a job at the gym just so they could work out for free. Do we value that? And when we do, what we do is we don't get this balance off. And so we talked about, again, this concept of student-centered instruction, that like we bring the things on the right and students bring the things on the left. But if we don't bring the things on the right, we're off balance when it comes to behavior. And so kids will come to us in really terrible moods. They face really significant barriers at home. Some of them come from trauma. They face barriers. Some of them have really traumatic experiences or have huge gaps in background knowledge or huge gaps in families who have the ability to teach them about, ways to self-regulate. Sometimes the temperament is off. That is the reality of the beautiful children that we teach. But if we don't create a classroom on the right, where we let kids set personalized goal, we let them choose their coping strategies and how they're going to self-regulate. We're very clear about the nature of instructions and what we expect them to accomplish. We provide them all the support they need. We say, if you're struggling, come over to talk to me. If you're struggling, use the calculator to check your answers. If you're struggling, grab an exemplar, work with a partner, put on your headphones, grab a granola bar from my desk. If you're struggling, do this. If we don't create that, if we don't say every time we review with students, let me give you some feedback on how not to get stuck next time. I love you. You know that you're an amazing kid. One little tweak and I think you would have been successful. I got you, because you know what? I will not let you fail. That's not how I go down. When someone believes in you that much and creates an environment that provides the options and choices that you need to be successful, you will be successful. And that is what UDL is all about. And I think in some ways it gets boiled down to like, well, I let them choose this book or this book, and it was still a disaster in my classroom. But when you start thinking about culturally responsive education, do they know and believe that we really have the highest of expectations for them? Do we really value who they are and get to know them? Do we allow them to bring themselves to the classroom? And when we do this in a really important way, students start to feel like they're really important as well. So any comments or questions on that concept there? So I have a couple questions. I know that Kevin and Seema said thank you. I just want to know if there's anything. I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. But any comments on just this big picture? And we're going to build on this and boil this down and finalize this in the last webinar when we bring everything together. But I just think some of those critical foundational pieces of UDL are often brushed over by presenters like myself, who kind of just assume that's a part of the foundation. Like, we're not going to do this until we have an asset-based view of everybody. We're not going to do this until we know that everybody belongs. And so one of the things that Seema just wrote is, what you are saying, it's important for teachers to form good relationships as the foundation. I could not say that enough times. If we don't believe in kids, if we don't believe in the power of relationships, I promise you that UDL will not work, because teaching is an emotional experience. Learning is an emotional experience. And when we don't connect emotionally with our students and their families and our colleagues, all the choices in the world won't matter, because a kid's going to say, it doesn't matter which one I pick. This teacher's not going to give a crap about me anyway. It doesn't matter which one I pick, because if I get frustrated, I'm going to get kicked out of class. My kids knew they would never get kicked out of class. It was okay to make mistakes. It was okay to embrace barriers. And that allowed me to provide the choices that allowed them to be successful. So thank you so much for having me. Again, I just have one last slide here, and then I'll tie it up. And then we're going to come back to, in the next webinar, we're going to come all of it together here. But what I really want to bring forward is just this concept about, we're going to think about how we create a strategic plan for building behavior and social emotional expectations into our academic expectations for our students. And then that brings UDL big picture, so you can start to talk with your colleagues like, hey, this isn't just about designing a science or a math lesson. This is about how to create a system where all kids have equitable access to Tier 1, where they are supported in every single way by teachers who believe in them.
Thank you so much, Katie. Such great information in a short period of time. My favorite quote is, I got this, I got you. So I would just like to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded. It can be found or archived at www.sipinclusion.org. And our next webinar with Katie is December 13th at 3:30. So thank you so much, and we will see you in a week. Thanks.